You know, when Jesus says things in the Golden Rule, like in everything, you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, he's given it some kind of special significance. You can find some kind of version of the Golden Rule in a wide variety of places, philosophers and other religions, but when Jesus says it, he says it for a different reason or for a different purpose. I've been thinking about that as I looked at this verse, trying to figure out exactly why Jesus would tell us to do things in that way. I noticed, for one thing, that this verse kind of falls after several verses where Jesus has been describing what God is like. He's been describing a heavenly Father who sees the needs of his children and seeks to meet them in the best possible way. He's a Father who is concerned for what is in the best interest of that person. It's striking to me that in some ways then, when Jesus gives us the Golden Rule, He's giving us some kind of guideline that helps us to shape a way of living for us that is godly, that is like God. Jesus has called upon his followers earlier in this Sermon on the Mount passage where this verse falls to love and to pray for their enemies. He's called upon them to treat people in ways that are kinder than they deserve. In fact, there in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, he says, look, you've heard it said that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus says, I tell you to live in a different way. I want you to love your enemies. I want you to pray for those people who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Because your Father in heaven, he says, he treats everybody the same. He causes the sun to rise and to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. And he sends rain for those who need the rain. He says if you treat only the people that are kind to you in a kind sort of way, you're not being any different than the tax collectors. He kind of brings it all down there in verse 38. He says, you're to be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Which makes it seem to me that when Jesus says that we should do to others as we would have them do unto us, we're redefining how we treat other people. It's no longer dependent or contingent upon their behavior. We're actually treating them in grace, like God would treat us. We're being godly. We're living out what it is like. We're living out what God would treat us in that sort of way. That's a pretty big deal. It also, it seems to me, that when Jesus says this, helps to ensure that our lives truly express what Jesus called the second greatest commandment. Because he tacks on the end of that verse 12 there, for this sums up the law and the prophets. He said, if you do this, if you do to someone else as we would have them do to us, we're fulfilling the law. We're living out God's will for his people. You know, another time Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was. And in that commandment, or in his response to that question, Jesus kind of summed it all up with two phrases. In fact, we read about it there in Matthew chapter 22. Jesus, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, and one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? And we read there that Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And he said, and the second is like it. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All the law and the prophets. It sums up the law and the prophets. When we keep that second greatest commandment, we're loving our neighbor as ourselves. It's a phrase that the people would have known well. It comes right out of Leviticus chapter 19. Verse 18, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. When we treat each other in the way in which Jesus called us to live here, as we would have them do to us, we're really helping to fulfill our love for God and neighbor. We're treating other people as God would treat us. We're expressing our love for Him by seeking to fulfill His heart for others, for other people, for our neighbor. We're becoming more like Him, and we're living out His will for our lives. Which means that it's something more than just kind of a general good principle for how to live. It's not just that Jesus was saying, hey, you know, it'd be a good idea if you were kind to people when you got a chance, or if you treated them in the way that you would want to be treated. But Jesus is actually telling us here that when we do that, we're living out the way that God would have us to live. We're living out His will, and in doing so, we're actually behaving more like Him. We're more godly in the way in which we live. And that makes that a pretty significant matter. Maybe it's not as small as we thought. maybe failing to keep this commandment is a bigger deal than we really thought.